Hello there, grade school. How are you today? I'm excited to be with you guys. It's going to be a good session today. I'm doing pretty good. I was just telling my buddy Rafa, who's here with me. Hey, Rafa.
Hello, Colin. Hello, everyone.
Rafa and I were just talking before we started the session here about my week, which has been a little bit more like, color science heavy than I would prefer. I kind of like to evenly divide my time between color grading and color science. It's been skewing pretty color science heavy this week and kind of the tedious, not like look dev side of color science. So put it this way, I'm really glad to be with you guys and talking and discussing creative aspects of what we do and not looking at a spreadsheet. I've been in Google Sheets and doing formulas and stuff a lot this week. Kind of fun. After a while, it gets a little bit old. So I'm glad to be with you guys. I hope you guys are doing awesome. And we're going to have a fun session today because we're talking about qualifiers and about the way that they really work and what they really are. As I said in this week's pre-recorded video, one of the things that we haven't discussed as much here on the channel, even though I've talked about or dismissed qualifiers a lot, is what they actually are and how they work. So we got to touch on a good portion of that in the pre-recorded video, and we're going to get to go much deeper today. One thing that I thought would be interesting to start off with before we dive into everybody's questions would be something that started for me as a question that came up in my mind. I don't know, maybe a couple of years ago now, but I can remember like there was this odd interval for me as a colorist of realizing like coming to the belief that I have now, which is that like, well, qualifiers have a role to play, but they're a very specialized instrument and they need to be used with a fair amount of knowledge and they need to be applied to the right tasks. They're not a broad tool. They're not a tool with lots of different application. They're kind of only good at one specific thing. I can remember really realizing and becoming convicted of that after I was deepening my understanding of color science. And then within that kind of same period, looking up and realizing like, wait, there are all these colorists who I really respect, who I really admire, whose work I really, really love, who use qualifiers a lot. So what gives with that? How does that work? What does that say about my conclusion? And one of the things that I realized was, well, two things. First of all, I realized that many of those colorists who I admire and who would claim the use of qualifiers, when I started to look a little bit more deeply, I noticed that they are, for the most part, adhering to one of the things you guys have heard me talk about with qualifiers, which is that if you got to do one, do it on one channel. And if you can get it done with any of the three channels, being hue, saturation, or luminance, the best one to use is going to be luminance because it's going to be the cleanest, right? And I did indeed find, okay, most of these colorists I'm talking about are using luminance as their baseline, and they may or may not be adding other channel kind of limiter qualifications on top of that. But with that in mind, I just want to show you guys something that I kind of like startled upon during that time that I thought you might find interesting. Oh, look, I'm already in Resolve. I've already been looking at this image. So let's just do a little thing here. I'm going to grab, I don't know if you guys know this about me. I often move it during grade school, but I'm kind of like I like to use both hands. I've got my pen here and I've got my mouse here. It's useful for certain things. But what I want to look at right now is I want to look at a grayscale ramp, my favorite sort of assessment tool. We're going to bypass our color management on this clip, so we're just looking at this pure ramp on the waveform. I'm going to go in and kill my look, like so. And let's just do a really simple thing. This is like a classic example of when I talk about like elite colorists who are using qualifiers really, really well, I'm going to show you one of the most common things I see them doing. It's something like this. I'm going to go in and I'm going to work my high, not my high softness, but my high range on my HSL qualifier here, like so. I'm using my control surface, but hopefully you can see the little high end of the luminance thing changing. I'm going to go to my highlight mode, so it's really easy for me to see, kind of where am I having my effect. So somewhere you can see even here in the waveform, it's this like bottom third of the final signal that I'm really kind of manipulating. I'm going to introduce a little bit of softness here, like so. And now let's turn this highlight mode off and let's kind of get some drama about things. I'm going to turn off this view for a second and just go back to like the full-on grade. So here's an example. Like all I've done is qualify my low end of the image like this, right? And something that I see colorists who I like do all the time is they'll kind of soften things out down there. So I'm just working my contrast and my pivot. down in that region. So basically what it means is that I'm really, really being gentle on my shadows, even as I kind of like maintain contrast elsewhere in the image. Or, really I'm just kind of like finessing my shadows. Like, that looks pretty good to me. Before, after. I'm just kind of going deeper, but also like softer. It just kind of feels good down there, right? This is like a move that I see colorists I dig use all the time. It's like a really good move in general. So like, steal this move. If this is all you get out of grade school today, this move is worth it in my opinion. But here's what I find interesting. So like, if I go back to my original question, how do I level this with all that trash that I talk about qualifiers, and with my sort of conviction at the time, newfound conviction, that like, you know what, qualifiers are really not the best way to achieve most goals, and they're kind of sharp and narrow and not the best tool. How do I level that? Well, let's take a look at what this is effectively doing to my image on a curve basis. There it is right there. It's just a curve. That was like my light bulb. I'm like, it's just a curve. And if I do the qualifier poorly, say for example, if I go really hard on my softness, if I go to a 0 softness, you can actually see the break in the curve, right? And even though none of us would probably make that big of a mistake, we might do something like that, which isn't great, Or maybe we're making too big of an adjustment and doing something funky like that. That's really obvious when we look at it on a ramp. Might not be obvious depending on the image that we are actually grading at the time. So that was my big aha that I thought I would share with you guys, is you can think of like any qualifier. You could re-envision it as like, okay, what is that in terms of an X versus Y curve, in terms of like an HSL curve in Resolve? And you can oftentimes get a better result by reimagining an adjustment in terms of what its effective curve is, because the curve, unlike the qualifier, shows you when you're getting sharp and narrow, jagged, broken. Whereas in the qualifier, you have to do this little crazy experiment that I just did right here in order to get that lens on things. But I just thought I would share that with you guys as like, first of all, sort of my answer to my own question of a couple of years ago, like, well, what does that mean if like all these colorists who I love are using qualifiers? Well, what it means is that they are using the qualifier to draw, in this case, a loom versus loom curve that just happens to, because they're experienced with the tool, they know how to end up creating a nice, soft, gentle, effective curve because they've got lots of practice and because they're good at what they do. But in my opinion, they're really just using maybe an odd tool to get at a really good result. So that's my own answer to my own question that I brought into grade school today. And I promise that's the only question that I'll ask today. The rest of the questions can come from you guys. Let's hear what we got out there. We got any good ones, Rafa?
Yeah, we have a question straight up about what you just explained, basically. And what is the difference between this method and what you can already do in the HDR wheels?
So again, I think like you guys know, as I already copped to today, my way of understanding almost any operation in color grading is to evaluate it in terms of a curve. So that can get more complicated depending on what you were doing, and the curve will not tell you everything. But if we bypass our color management again here, we can do the same experiment. We can go to our HDR wheels and you can evaluate, at least on a 1D basis, what am I doing? What is the net curve of my operation? This is a great question to get into the habit of asking yourself, either when you're trying a new tool, when you are applying an adjustment to a particular shot and you want to get a sense for like, is that nice and clean, or you have a suspicion that it might be a little bit rough on the image? Throw up a grayscale ramp like I'm doing here. We should make this a free download for you guys, shouldn't we? We're going to make that happen because this is a really useful tool. You can also generate it within Resolve, which I can show you how to do at some other point. But looking at what you're doing on a grayscale ramp is a great practice to get into. But you can see, like when you look at your different ranges and moving them up or down, like that's quite similar. And short answer to the question that you just asked, could you one-to-one match exactly what I just did in the qualifier by adjusting your values within the HDR wheels and adjusting your like zone pivot and your fall-offs and everything? Yeah, you absolutely could. And it goes the other way too. You could do something here and then decide I want to do it as a qualifier. So really the question for me becomes like something that I talk about in my book, The Colorist 10 Commandments. How do I choose the right tools? And when I say right tools, I don't just mean what's the tool that can get the job done. The reality is if you randomly picked 10% of the tools in Resolve out of a hat and said, this is all you get, Cullen, I or any other good colorist would find a way to achieve my creative agenda with that randomly selected set of tools. So it's not just about what tools can get the job done. It's what tools can get the job done in the very best, most efficient, most intuitive way. And that answer may differ from one colorist to the next, but that's kind of how I think about those things, and why I get so interested in figuring out all right, what's the best tool? And then for me as a color scientist, I'll go even further and say, does that tool exist in Resolve? And if it doesn't, why doesn't it? And can it exist? And then I'll often go in and create my own tool. But that's the chapter of my book that I would point you toward if you haven't read it already. It's worth checking out. It's called Choose the Right Tools. It's really all about figuring out what is not just a functional, but what is the optimal tool to apply to the task at hand.
All right. We also have a couple of questions about how qualifiers behave in basically large spaces like DaVinci Resolve, DaVinci Intermediate. The range, for example, for luminance starts around at 50%. Until that, every value that goes under that doesn't really have any information. So is the qualifier color space aware? How does it work in those color space, in those big color space?
Yeah, you know what? I'm really glad this came up because, to be honest with you guys, this is something that I've explored. I think we even explored it here in grade school before, but it's been a minute and I want to see if it's changed. So let's just do a quick experiment here. Let's do the most simple experiment I can think of, which is just to go from wide gamut intermediate to gamma 2.4. We're going to do my favorite exercise here. We're going to make a sandwich. So we're going to go from wide gamut intermediate to gamma 2.4. I'm going to leave tone mapping and gamut mapping off just so it's easy to get back into the other space. So let's label this. We're going to say 2, 7, or 9. And then we're going to do another one. I'm fired up for the new version of Resolve where we can do an automatic swap of input and output, but I'm not brave enough to update my systems to a beta just yet. Have you guys done that? Any horror stories, or is everything going smoothly? Let me know. So if we look at this sandwich that I've made here, we're going DaVinci wide gamut, DaVinci intermediate to Rec 709, gamma 2.4. All this junk turned off with the exception of white point, which doesn't even need to be on. It's not doing anything. And then we're going to do the exact opposite. 709, gamma 2.4, DaVinci wide gamut intermediate. All this junk turned off. So as we're fond of doing here in grade school and on the channel, we've created a do-nothing sandwich. This round trip results in no change to the image at all. But this is really useful for our purposes because we want to evaluate what is the functional difference between the qualifier, its ranges, its feel in log space versus in gamma space. So here would be this is the classic domain of the qualifier. This is really what the engineers had in mind when they designed the qualifier way back when. It was for operating in gamma or display space. So the question is, how does it work comparatively in log space like we are in here in DaVinci wide gamut? So let's just do a simple example. Maybe we'll do two. But for one, since the question was about luminance ranges, I'm just going to go in, turn on my highlight mode, and sweep until I'm looking at a particular selection of dark values, like so. So maybe something like that, and do just a little bit of softness. Now, let's just try something here. I'm going to tap node number 2 here, hit Command C, go to shot number 4, or node number 4 rather, and hit Command V, and we can see kind of the difference between those two things. Like so. Now I'm actually curious. I want to double check that my color management is set up properly, which it is. So if we look at the difference between these two things, we're getting a bit counterintuitively, because we're in log and everything is sort of pushed up, we're actually getting more shadow by qualifying in log than we are by qualifying the exact same range in our gamma space. But let's also do another example. This is the one that always comes up for me that I always question. Let's try saturation. So if we go into, again, here in log space, and let's just sweep our saturation, let's sweep our high saturations down. And you're gonna see, I can just go down, 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 down. I'm almost at a saturation high value of like 1 before anything starts to go away. Yeah, I mean, I have to get to like a 0.7 to qualify out a good chunk of my image, like so. So if we have that as the qualification here in our log space, and let's just keep a completely hard edge on this. Let's do the same experiment. Go over here and hit Command V. So those are somewhat different. Now, the part that I'm not sure about, that I'm kind of thinking through on the fly, is the color space awareness of this image. So in other words, if I am, let's put it this way, if I want to use any kind of color management at all, let's just try something here. If I change my timeline color space, is the qualifier's behavior going to change? I'm going to change this to Rec 709 Gamma 24 to reflect what's actually happening here. So I'm going to hit save. And it doesn't actually look like the matte itself is changing. Let's go to the highlight, the black and white mode here, and try that again. So we're here. No, that actually is changing. So what does that mean? What does that tell us? I think what that tells us is, put it this way, if we look here, this I'm going to expect is going to exactly match. This is a cheap trick, but it will work for us. I'm just going to grab a screenshot of this because I want to see what this matte looks like with that setting turned on versus my log matte in this domain, like so. So let's go back. Well, let's see here. Sorry. Let's try like this. I'm going to change my timeline color space back to 709 Gamma 24 here. We'll watch that image change. So this is 709 Gamma 24. And I am qualifying like so. So I'm just qualifying with the expectation that that's the domain of my image, which is effectively what I'm doing here. And if we grab a still of that, well, let's see. Yeah, interestingly, those are, well, I think we need to actually have that on. You know what? I'm going to be honest with you guys. I'm like getting a little tailspun here. Short answer, I don't know. Unless we are explicitly changing the domain of our color space, let's just simplify a little bit. Let's go back to our stock settings here and hit save. And let's go back to our normal highlight mode. So we can see that indeed, when we use a color space transform to change our color space, we apparently can get a slightly different qualification range. Now, it's not much. Like the biggest area that I see problem with the original question or with the original like issue that was being raised is like, it sure would be nice if I could separate out low, medium, and high saturations with more than 1% of my 100% range here. So by moving into 709 Gamma 24, instead of having things pivot around like a 0.7, they go up to around, say, a 1.2 or so. So it's not like night and day, but it does seem that if you wanted to go to this trouble within log of kind of like round tripping into another space, that there might be a benefit to that. Or maybe you could just simply change your color space in gamma here in your tag. Let's see if that works before I round out my very long meandering answer to this question. Like so. And that produces yet another result. Like, yeah. So that one actually kind of puts me back into, like if I copy and paste my adjustments here and change. So right now my qualifier is identical and I change my color space here. Yeah, that has no effect. So that's not actually changing the qualifier. So that won't do you any good. So essentially, all that you have to change the way the qualifier behaves is the actual state of the image that you are feeding into it, like so. So when I move into 709, I can pull a slightly different qualifier, maybe have a slightly easier time pulling a qualifier, and then I can move back into DaVinci Wide Gamut or whatever my log space is. that took a minute. That was an interesting exploration. I hope that gives some clarity, or at least a line of further inquiry into the behavior of qualifiers in different color spaces.
Let's talk about other kind of qualifiers for a second. You only mentioned in your video the HSL qualifier, but what do you think about the other type, like the RGB or the 3D qualifier?
Yeah, so those are definitely worth talking about. I was hoping we get to cover them today. So RGB and HSL qualifier. Let's wipe out some of this junk. We don't need this. Where's my pretty look? Okay, it's back. And we're no longer bypassed. Okay, good. So let's look at our other qualifiers. The short answer to the question, can you sometimes get better results or different results with the RGB qualifier or with the 3D qualifier than with the HSL qualifier? Yeah, you absolutely can. Here would be my thing. What I like about the HSL qualifier, the number one thing, is that I can go in with an explicit criteria and say, this is a simple example. I can say, I want to select all of my colors that are low in saturation and low in luminance. That would be like a sensible qualifier to pull. And other than the problems that we were just talking about with like the saturation range being so funky, that would be very easy for me to do. I'm going to say, well, if I want to qualify those low things, then I'm going to go into my qualifier and I'm going to sweep my luminance down so that I'm only leaving in the darker values. Let's turn the highlight mode back on. Again, using, of course, my image as the guide for what low means. And then when I look at my saturation, same thing. I'm going to go in and sweep the high and say, like, I want to maybe get that red scarf out of the bargain if I can. Yeah, something like that. So like that is, even with like the odd sort of ranges that we sometimes see in the qualifier here, that's quite intuitive to me because I have dedicated channels for the things that I'm conceiving of qualifying based on. So I want to qualify based on luminance and saturation because those are intuitive to me, and I've got channels for that. So in that sense, it's fairly intuitive. Now, let's just, for fun, try the same experiment using the RGB qualifier. If I go in here and just say like, all right, I want to pull, whatever, these low values, but I want to leave the red out. So I've got a baseline that's close-ish to where I was before. Now, what do I do if I want to refine this? Unless I just want to keep dragging around the image. I'm like, well, I guess I could reduce my red high end. Yeah, but now that's also changing the luminance level of what I'm qualifying because luminance is coming from a combination of red, green, and blue, right? So that's a really good example to me of like, if you pressed me right now, there's not a single knob that I can know to adjust that is going to allow me to exclude the red scarf, where back in the HSL qualifier, there totally was. It was like, oh, go to that high sat, pull it in, and you're good, So it doesn't mean this can't work, but it means you're left to kind of like just feeling around or, doing stuff like if I went to this like minus button, I could say, oh, like let's leave that out of the deal. But that's, as you can see, like not necessarily netting the best results. So it turns even if the ranges and stuff are kind of tricky, it turns something predictable into something that I just kind of have to keep grabbing for possible solutions until I find one. So that's the reality with the RGB for me. Doesn't mean you can't or shouldn't use it. It's just a reason for me that I'm like, well, that it might get me a better result, but how long is it going to take me to get there? And how am I going to know it's going to get me a better result until I spend all that time on pursuing it? So it's kind of an unknown. And then if we look at the 3D qualifier, here would be my suggestion on the 3D qualifier. By the time you're doing a 3D qualification, which is pretty complex in character, what I would recommend at this point would be the use of your magic mask. And we haven't talked much about the magic mask here on the channel because I feel like it's still been evolving. I mean, honestly, that's the best version of the key I've been trying to pull that I've seen yet. So, maybe that's serviceable. I don't know. But for me, by the time I'm into a 3D qualifier, and in this case, I'm looking at YUV, you could look at different versions of this. This could be, maybe I'll revise what I'm saying here, actually. I feel like this might be more interesting potentially than the RGB, trying these different color models and qualifying within them and like drawing shapes within them to see if you can get something interesting. But at a certain point, like the TLDR here would be that like, if I can't, like, ideally I can use HSL because I know the exact, those are criteria that I think in terms of. Very few of us think of like a low saturation shadow in terms of like how much red, green, and blue is in that. You know what I mean? Whereas with HSL, that's quite intuitive for me to go like, well, that's low end of the luminance, low end of the saturation curve. So if I have to go much beyond that and things are not intuitive to me, or it's not, I don't know ahead of time, I'm going to be able to pull a really good key. That to me makes the image a really good candidate for using the magic mask as opposed to any of the qualifiers, if that makes sense.
A little insight that Jim shared with us in the comments. Basically, we haven't seen the qualifiers changing before because you have selected the basically using color space aware tools. But if you disable that, everything should change between color spaces.
Really?
Yeah.
That is interesting. Jim, get up here, dude. I'm going to sit down. I'm just going to follow along, man. That's gold, if that's the way it's actually working here. So if we were to, I mean, we were, yeah, like, so I'm assuming the easiest way to test your idea here, Jim, would be like, all right, if we sweep our luminance range, like so, now that I've turned color space aware grading tools off, which by the way was in my project settings, color management, color space aware grading tools. Now, if I change my gamma like to linear, I should get a different result. Because before, I was seeing a change with my, when I moved color spaces. Like, let's just do a quick experiment here. When I go from, I'm just going to say use timeline, even though I usually discourage you guys from doing that because I don't trust it. For the sake of speed, I am going to use it. So if I go from DaVinci wide gamut to 709 gamut 2.4, I've got, here's this same qualifier before and after the image. And let's turn this, yeah, so this is off for now. So even with that turned off, I am seeing different ranges being qualified here. So how does that change if I turn it on? Doesn't actually seem to affect the qualifier. Yeah, I don't have an exact answer for like I'll put it to you guys this way. Since I think Resolve 17, there's been a claim in the documentation for Resolve that's like, hey, the qualifier is now color space aware. But I've kind of been trying to like pin that down, what that means and whether it's true for a while now, and I'm still not sure. It's actually a good reminder to me. I should reach out to our friends at Blackmagic and just confirm what the intended and actual behavior of the qualifier is, because that color space aware grading tools thing I'm sure would apply to like the HDR zones, but it doesn't seem, at least with me thinking on the fly right now, I can't seem to think of a way to make it affect the behavior of the qualifier. But maybe I'm missing something, and let me know if so, Jim.
A little insight that I have to share is that, at least in my testing, this works very well in Fusion as well, because I use the linear color space to basically qualify skies all the time for sky replacements.
Sure, because you're going to have like lots more color separation in there, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, it's so funny. Like, you know, within Resolve here, like, yeah, that's actually a really good strategy. We could do something like that. Of course, then you're going to have some harder edges to contend with, but that can be, at least you've got the region of interest that you need.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Well, we're all learning things and finding more mysteries as we go along. What else we got?
We have a question here from Crimson, and he's asking, besides 8-bit footage, what kinds of footage should not you should avoid pulling a qualifier? And I want to add to that question, since I know you, what kind of footage should you pull a qualifier?
Oh, we're getting right to the meat of the matter. This is probably the most important question that we are going to cover today. So, what footage should I or shouldn't I use a qualifier on? I want to rephrase that question a little bit. To me, it's not a question of what footage should I use a qualifier on. There is no footage that I'm like, oh, this is 8-bit as an easy example, so I will not use a qualifier. There's also no footage that I'm like, oh, this is pristine, airy raw, 16-bit right off the sensor, so I'm going to use qualifiers because I know I can. It's not that simple. It's more a matter of what am I trying to do and what's the simplest, cleanest way to achieve it. And if that's a qualifier, does that work? Or do I, like ultimately we may want to do things to our footage that our footage just won't let us do. If you expose something 4 stops under and you want to go for like a completely level, open, airy exposure level, there is no tool that's going to do that. It doesn't matter what, like we talked about choosing the right tools before. To think about that simple example, there's no tool. It doesn't matter how perfectly you select some particular tool and how artfully you twist the knob for it, it's not going to work. That goal isn't supported by the material. So there is that reality. But let's set that aside for a moment and just say, like, across the board, we can all recognize that. We can all recognize, like, oh, that's great that you want to open it up 5 stops. It's not going to work, so you need to recalibrate your expectations. Short of that, what are our principles for when we use a qualifier and when we don't? Here's what I'm going to say. This is, again, something right out of my book, The Colorist 10 Commandments. Broad beats narrow. That's one of the chapters of The Colorist 10 Commandments. So what that means is we want to find the broadest possible tool for accomplishing our goal. So if we, for example, want to get, we kind of use this as a demonstration at the beginning of grade school today. If we want to get thicker shadows, what is the absolute easiest way to get thicker shadows in Resolve? What is the cleanest, broadest, simplest way to get thicker shadows in Resolve? I probably won't wait for the answers to flood through on the chat because of the darn lag on YouTube. I wish we were in a Zoom call for moments like this. But I want you to think about it for your own sake. What's the simplest way for me to get thicker shadows? You have an answer in your mind? It's simpler than you think. Whatever your answer is, it's probably simpler than that. Offset. That's the simplest way for me to get thicker shadows. Shadows, thicker. You cannot tell me I'm wrong. My shadows are indeed thicker. Now, is that the right tool? Well, that depends on my creative agenda because this is such a broad tool. This is, in fact, the broadest possible tool that I can use in Resolve. So in addition to getting thicker shadows, I'm getting a darker image, aren't I? I'm also getting weaker highlights. So this might be too broad of a tool. So the idea of broad beats narrow isn't you should choose a tool that does things to parts of the image you don't want to affect, but the premise is you should choose the broadest possible tool that does accomplish only the part of your goal that you're concerned with. Okay. So what would the next one down from there be? Well, that would be lift, wouldn't it? And that's probably, in this case, going to be pretty sufficient. Like so. Like, let's just say we want to get those kind of like thicker shadows. But again, it depends on what your goal is. Like, if your goal is just to have some thicker shadows, then that's probably a decent start, especially if you pair this with a little bit of gain. So you're going down in lift and up in gain so that you're still keeping those peaks kind of at a similar level. And you can see it even here on my waveform. I'm just getting thicker down in the bottom. That's a good example of like, all right, that's still a super broad tool that could be a perfectly viable option for making your adjustment. Now, if we look at like, all right, well, what if we wanted to do this as a qualification? Well, we could do it in a couple different ways. We could use the qualifier, or for me, the next broadest tool would be to use either like HDR zones or log wheels, but those are, again, kind of tough to know what your effective range is. So instead, we could do something like our custom curves, and you could do something like this. We could say like, I'm going to use my DaVinci Wide Gamut Gray. This is just mid-gray in my DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate color space. I'm going to option click my custom curve, so I've got a control point there. And I'm going to say or actually let me do that in a separate node, like so. And I'm going to say now, instead of a lift operation, which by the way, if you want to see lift on the curves, this is lift. Deeper lift, brighter lift, okay? So now I'm saying, well, instead of doing my lift in that broad of a fashion, I'm going to mess with the bottom end of the image, but I'm only going to have effect below middle gray. So that's a narrower tool, right? That is not as broad as lift, which is not as broad as offset. But you can hopefully see the kind of ladder of complexity that I'm climbing up only as my creative needs demand. So reason I go into all this is because the qualifier kind of sits at the top of that ladder. Like, it's a very narrow tool. Now, you can be broader or narrower even within the qualifier, but fundamentally it is a narrower tool. The only reason you would use it is to make narrower selections than you are able to get with something like gain or lift or gamma or even your custom curves. So when should you use a qualifier? When there is no broader tool which serves your creative agenda. I mean, that's kind of the simple answer there. And another great alternative, because so far we've talked about a lot of like luminance adjustments within qualifiers, but of course we qualify like, the biggest like misuse of qualifiers that I see out there among new colorists is qualifying skin tone. Well, there's a number of problems with that, but let's just say for a moment that we do indeed want to explicitly change the skin tone of our subject in some fashion. Let's say we want to saturate it. A good alternative to qualifying my subject's skin tone would be to do a broader version of that, where I go to a hue versus sat, and I eyedropper this range, and I drive that value upward, like so. That's very similar to what the qualifier will do, but again, as I mentioned at the beginning of the episode today here, I can see how broad or tight my curvature is here, and if I do something dumb like that, where it's like, oh, that's like impossibly tight and jagged, and you can see the detrimental effect that's having on the image here, it's obvious I don't need to see this image to know that this sucks. You know what I mean? In the qualifier, that's not so easy to determine always because it's just a bunch of numbers. So this has the potential to be broader and softer. It generally is. And it also will tell you when you are getting too narrow in a way that the qualifier typically won't. So that's how I would think about the qualifier is like, is there any possible tool that is broader, softer, gentler that I could use to accomplish my goal than the qualifier? And if not, then I want to use the qualifier itself with those same principles. I want to work as broadly and softly and simply as possible. We talked about this in the video this week. Within the qualifier, one channel if you can, luminance if you can get it done with luminance, two channels if one won't do. Try to avoid three channels. Try to introduce lots of softness at the edges of your ranges so that you are taking out an insurance policy against, like a qualifier. You guys have probably heard me make this analogy before. A qualifier is akin to like a surgeon's scalpel. We would not want to have no surgery in modern medicine. Surgery is a very beneficial medical practice in certain situations. But if you can get it done with diet and exercise, that's probably going to be better than going under the knife, right? Same thing with our images.
All right, let's take a race from qualifiers for a second. I love using Power Windows for making my grades pop, but sometimes the foreground elements get in the way of the background. So any tips on how to work around this?
Sometimes the foreground elements get in the way of the background. So if I'm sort of envisioning the right thing in my mind, I'm seeing a situation where maybe you're knocking down your background, but then your foreground is occluding or coming into that power window range. I hope I'm getting that right. Here's one thing you could try. Do I have any motion elements? Got a bunch of static shots in here. This one might work. So, it really just depends on the specific example. But actually, what you just described, one solution, depending on the specifics, could be a qualifier. So if you were to do something like, what if I want to, let's just wipe out my template. Or no, it's fine, I'll leave this up. What if down here in my secondaries branch of my node graph, what if I'm doing something like, I have no idea how far off the reservation of the kind of adjustments that you're talking about this is, but let's say, in the background, I'm really wanting to, warm up this highlight, like so. And really give it kind of like a nice yellowy character. And it's nice and soft, like that. That's kind of pretty, right? Maybe that's the thing. Now, do I want what's happening on her? It's actually not bad, but maybe I don't. Maybe this is an example of the foreground kind of stepping into something like if she wasn't here and I just wanted to control this light pouring in from overhead, this would be the shape and the position of my window in an ideal scenario. But I've got a person who's stepping into the frame here. So this is something I often use qualifiers for, and is right in line with that principle I just talked about of using one channel and letting that channel be luminance if possible. I'm just going to go in, turn my highlight mode on, and sweep my luminance range from the bottom and say like, yeah, none of that stuff gets emitted into the party. And then go nice and soft on the low end. Again, maybe sweep back up a little bit more like this, nice and soft again. And now, if I go off and on, that same window is having a nice, soft, gentle effect on the area I want to influence, and it's having no effect on her whatsoever. If I go in here and I turn this qualifier off, here's where it was before, here's where it is with that turned on. So like that's one very arbitrary example, but that's something you can often use to your advantage. If you've got foreground occluding background, that's a great place to think about, maybe I can use a qualifier. Do those things have a distinction in terms of their luminance? Are they well separated in terms of luminance? Or are they well separated in terms of hue? That would be the backup option, saturation being a distant third. But if they're well separated in terms of their hue or their luminance, then you could look at using a qualifier to say, hey, if it's not inside the sweet spot for the hue range of that background thing that I'm trying to affect with lots of softness built in, then leave it out of the party and introduce that exclusion by using a qualifier. So combining qualifiers and power windows is a really good way of netting out to a focused but nice and gentle sort of like selective grade of particular elements in the frame. Have we solved the mysteries of color grading? One day we're going to come into grade school and there's going to be a unanimous like, you're done, dude. We don't need anything else. We all know what we need to know and we're ready to go. I hope that's not today.
Can you hear me? It seems I lost the connection for a second.
Yeah, I got you now.
All right, perfect. Let's go to a similar question. Basically, how do you handle the scenarios where it's hard to get a qualify on the skin or in the background because the background and the skin are very similar?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, so I love talking about this. Actually, we're on a great shot to evaluate this on. So like, like this shot looks really, really nice, especially under this look that I've got happening here. But we're definitely kind of like, we're all in this upper left warm quadrant right now, aren't we? And there's not a ton of separation between her face and the background. Like she's more saturated, but like kind of similar hue vector. You can even see it here in the vector scope. So how do you deal with wanting to qualify one from the other? Well, this is a good example to me of like asking better questions leading to better outcomes. So really, if you're saying you're trying to qualify your subject distinctly from a background, for example, well, I'm going to assume that you are wanting to do that because you're feeling there's not enough separation. Like, what are you going to do once you pull that qualification? Nothing? No, you're going to do something to try to move the background or move the subject, I'm going to assume, right? Otherwise, what's the point of pulling a qualifier? So if we think about it from that POV of like, all right, well, what are you going to do? What are you looking to achieve after you pull this qualification? Let's infer that you are looking to achieve greater color separation. So the number one thing, like, first of all, color separation, that's something you should be thinking about like just as a through line when you're color grading. It's very, very rare to be in a situation where you're like, gosh, I just can't get the color separation tamed in these images. Did anybody ever have that experience? I haven't. Like, I'm not saying there's never a situation where you want less color separation, but that's easy, isn't it? You trim your saturation back, you move things into the cool quadrant, you move things into the warm quadrant. That's kind of easy. What can be really tricky, as this question implies, is like, yeah, but what if I want more separation? Because separation is such a desirable trait in an image, and not all images have a lot of innate separation. What do we do then? How do I get more separation into the image? So that should be something that we're always thinking about. And this is a great example to me of wanting to make sure that we are using the broadest, softest tools that we can, even if they're not getting us all the way there. If it's getting us 50, 60, 70% of the way there, that's now less work that a qualifier or something narrower has to do for us. So in a shot like this, instead of trying to go in and qualify her as separate from the background, which like, let's just do that at face value for a second here. If I try, I'm going to have trouble, right? Like I can go in and I can fuss with these things and maybe like take that problematic saturation channel. No, it's still going to hold, like I'm not going to be able to get much better separation between the background and the foreground. I could go in and throw a power window around her and limit things that way. That might be a good solution depending on the way that the frame actually works in motion. But the bigger thing that I can do before any of this qualifier would be to go back to my basics, go back to that balance node, go back to that offset, and do what I'm always talking about here on the channel, that I'm always trying to do with my balance, which is to max out color separation. Max out skin tone and max out color separation. So if you just go in here, like that may not feel like night and day, but you can see even on my vector scope, I've got greater separation between her skin and the background than I did before. And this also means if I want to go in and do other things, if I want to do like, let's use our favorite trick, this like HSV sat, and just turn off channels 1 and 3, because I am not a fan of like standard saturation, as you guys know. If I want to go in and saturate things, I can. And I could even go back to my balance here. Let's turn this highlight mode off. Oh, there we go. Now we're under a look and things are looking really tasty. So once I've cooled things off here, like look how much more separation I got. Off, on, off, on. And if I wanted to go in and add more saturation, off, on, off, on. And let's do this. Let's just look at a before and after on this. So we were here, now we're there. I'm going to go like this. And let's go full frame with this. So before, after, before, after. This is the kind of thing, I see this so much out there. Like, again, as I said, with new colorists, I don't mean to dog on those of us who are learning, like we're trying to do good work. But like when we see images like this one, where it's like, oh, there's so much richness and separation, between background and foreground, and my eye just feels really easily led where it wants to go. The first intuition, if I were to tell you, hey, take this and make it look like that, the first intuition for a lot of new colors would be to pull a qualifier right off the bat, right? And if you grab it and you brute force it enough, you can probably get it close enough on that individual frame, but it's going to be dirty and it's going to take a lot of work to get there. When I did something totally different. I used offset and I used overall saturation to create more separation between subject and foreground. So when you're trying to, I don't mean to completely skirt your question, but the reality is like, I'm going to go ahead and make this a rule for you. Don't qualify skin tone. Your image should be balanced based on what optimizes skin tone. And then you can play with elements around skin as needed. So I wouldn't qualify skin tone in general. And if your explicit goal is like, well, I'm trying to qualify skin tone so that I can get more separation between skin tone and background, usually there's a broader way of going about that. Again, going back to the broad beats narrow principle, there's usually a broader way to go about achieving that goal without having to resort to the qualifier in the first place.
A super fun question here. If we move to HSL, LED, HSV, or whatever color space that is not RGB, and we use the RGB qualifier, does that behave properly?
Oh, that's a fun question. Yes, that will behave properly. So if you, now properly is of course a relative term. So like here's the reality. Like I've been dogging on like the if the question is like, oh, I'll focus this a little bit. Let's say we go into HSL and let's say we go into RGB. Is this H, is this S, and is this L? Yes, it is. Will it behave properly? Yes, it will, in the sense that these channels are now H, S, and L. Now, watch what happens if we try to qualify our saturation. We are not necessarily going to have any easier of a time than we did before, because saturations are all going to be living in a very finite range. And in fact, what we might need to do, because I think we discovered earlier that these tags are not taken into account when we use the qualifier, you might actually need to do an old school like sandwich on these things. So let's just do that real quick. And we're going to go to HSL. I'm going to do this the really kind of fast, lazy way. And then on this side, we're just going to come from HSL. We're making sandwiches. It'll be almost lunchtime when we're done with grade school here in LA. So maybe I can go have a sandwich. Love a good sandwich. So now we can see like, all right, we are now operating on our S channel, essentially. Yeah, so let's open up our low range to 0 and our high range like so. Yeah, interesting. Well, okay, that does make sense. We're just, here's the challenge here is going to be that you're getting like a pretty distorted view in this highlight mode. So you would want to look at it probably more like this. But yeah, like that will work. The only catch is like you're still going to have like the ranges are still going to be kind of funky, not identical to what we'd see in an HSL qualifier, but you're not necessarily going to have an easier time separating out different levels of saturation here than you would with the HSL qualifier. Because just to like give Blackmagic their credit, an S channel, that's just a computed channel when you're operating in log or in any color space for that model. An S channel is weak, like just by nature. It doesn't reach, most of its values are like way down there. So it's not just a question of Blackmagic like implementing a really bad qualifier. It's just kind of a reality of the S channel in models like HSL, HSV, LAB, etc. The amplitude, the strength of those channels is going to be pretty weak, which is why it's so difficult to pluck out discrete levels of saturation from them. But yes, to answer the question, totally. We've moved into HSL here, and we're moving back out of it like so. And let me just make sure I set that timeline color space back up correctly here, which I did. So yeah, now in my RGB, let's just prove this out with one more test here and say like, all right, well, we want to sweep our high end of our red, green, and blue like so. Yeah, that seems to be behaving properly. I can't swear 1,000% that there's not something else happening here with the way these red, green, and blue channels are being used, but I don't think so. So I think this is a perfectly sound idea, way to think about it.
Do you use qualifiers when working with brands who demand an exact color reproduction in their brand colors?
Typically, no. If it's got to be that way, it can. But here would be like something really good to keep in mind. I used to, for sure. But here's something to keep in mind. When you're talking about a situation where the client is going to be hyper critical of that product and of its color, right? So the last thing that you want to do is inadvertently introduce some chatter or noise or artifacting into that object. And that's what the qualifier is great at. You guys have heard me talk before about how qualifiers, you kind of have to babysit them for the rest of their life, because like you can never be 1,000% sure that some change elsewhere in your node tree isn't going to bump it. In fact, that's why I pull qualifiers down here, so that it's the qualification itself is going to be not affected by any changes I make up here. So I almost would be more averse to qualifying in that situation, because it's such a, like I can lose trust with a client instantly if they see that kind of chatter on the thing that's most important that they are paying me to make look amazing. That's a situation where I would 100% use my HSL curves as my go-to. I mean, the first thing I would do is use not power windows, use my balance, and then in appropriate cases use power windows to say like, hey, here's my overall balance. Now let's throw a window on the burger or whatever it is, and or on the on the box for the product or whatever that may be. Track the window if I need to, and finesse the balance within that power window. Because again, that's a nice, broad, simple, soft approach. But if I wanted to, or if I needed to, like you could also look at like, this is the shot that comes to mind here. And we're like, hey, we're in the teapot business. We make teapots. So one thing I would also be mindful of at a system level, like right now I'm on a look that I just know off the top of my head is doing stuff to this red. Before, after. I would make sure my look is doing things that support what we want to do to that teapot. And if not, I would change it. But let's say that we're looking at this and they're like, all right, our red teapot is actually more colorful than that. It really, really needs to pop, you know? Rather than pulling a qualifier, I would go to my hue versus sat, sweep it nice and broad, and pump it up, like so. See what I mean? That's still nice and localized, at least in this image, and that works really well. And here's another great example of where we can pair HSL curves and or qualifiers with a power window. In this case, I don't need to, but in other cases, I might want to limit that adjustment to the interior of a power window and then track that window if you need to. That way, I'm not like a power window is not going to introduce artifacts as long as it's nice and soft. An HSL curve is not going to introduce artifacts as long as it's nice and soft. And if I combine them, they're not going to be any more likely to introduce artifacts because they're combined. Does that make sense? As opposed to a qualifier where it's like, all right, I've got a general good range here, but I need to do something else in my ranges to keep this adjustment from affecting some other portion of the image. Now you are increasing your risk of introducing artifacts as opposed to combining clean operations or clean qualifications such as those from a power window and a HSL curve or a power window and a qualifier, a clean qualifier, if that makes sense. All right, we got time for a couple more.
Question here, not about qualifiers, but about OFX. Basically, the question is that some OFX work better using linear color space, but most OFX have a range from 0 to 1. And sometimes in linear, you have values over 1. So how do you deal with that problem?
Yeah, you know, it is a problem that I was actually chatting with some smart color science folks this week that like, yeah, linear domain, as you guys may know, like in log color space, if you know, like whatever, like this image was captured in area log C3, and so it doesn't have any code values that go higher than 1 because it all got packed into a 0 to 1 range within log C3. If I linearize this image, I'm going to get values in the case of ARI, in the case of log C3, I'm going to get values that can go up as high as 55. And in other log curves, it's even higher. I can go to 100 or 200 or even, you know, like into those ranges. So it's a good question of like, all right, if we want to operate in a linear domain, what's going to happen to those values between 1 and 55 if the tool is set to ignore or to clip or to clamp values above 1? The short answer is nothing good. So that's something that you kind of have to discover by trial and error. And if you discover this tool expects 0 to 1 but it does more of what I want in linear, there's not much you can do except to try to like essentially roll and unroll the image, which is not maybe the best thing, but you could look at like tone mapping. I'm trying to think of an easy easy tool to demo this on. This is maybe a good one to wrap us up here. You know, we could look at, let's see here. We could look at our texture pop. And I think I can get that to misbehave if I flip it into linear by affecting my, let's go to our advanced operating mode here. Maybe not. Yeah, I mean, I wish I had a handy example I could think of off the top of my head, but I would say like if you absolutely want to use a tool in linear and it is clamping your values above 1, you could do this. DaVinci wide gamut, DaVinci intermediate, DaVinci wide gamut, DaVinci intermediate, luminance mapping, custom max of 10,000, custom out of 100 essentially. And that is going to limit you down into a 0 to 1 range within DaVinci wide gamut intermediate. And then I would just make this kind of like your last stop before going forward through your system. Although, yeah, it gets it would be tricky to do with project level color management like we typically do here on the channel. So your best second option would be to try to invert it like so. And these probably won't be identical, although they're close. Depending on what you did in the tool, this round trip won't be lossless, but you could try something like this. This is going to compress you down into a range of 0 to 1, and then you can do your thing here and then stretch back out to your full range of 0 to, in the case of DaVinci Intermediate, 0 to 100. Something worth trying anyway. Depends on what the tool is. That might not even work depending on what it's doing in there, but it would be worth giving a try with. But it's a good question. And like I said, I was talking about it this week with some color science friends of like, well, how should tools behave? Should all scene space color grading tools operate with no expectation of an upper boundary? And some of us felt like, yeah, that would be ideal, but it's not the reality that we live in today. We could do one more if we got another good one.
Yeah, we have a very good question here. And basically, the question is that using only the hue section in the qualifier results into basically a blocky qualification compared to what the RGB, the HSL curves do, only using the hue as a qualifier. Why does that happen?
Yeah. I mean, that's a really good question. I haven't done like a scientific analysis of one versus the other. I have a feeling you could get the exact same effective selection by setting your params effectively in your hue. You could even go to your 6 vector. These things were like really popular like when I first started color grading. So let's say we want to do, like just a qualification of my reds. This is our 6 vector, and we can actually turn off these two guys completely. So there's my reds, and maybe that luminance thing. This is really designed more for 7 or 9 for like a display type of color space. But something like this is going to be close to what you would get with, like an HSL qualifier. Like if we do this and then we saturate those areas, like it depends on what you're trying to do, but saturation, even if we wanted to do like hue, like let's do kind of a crazy hue rotation, that's pretty clean. That's not bad. It's a broad and soft enough selection. You can kind of see it here you can kind of see some fringing here on the color chart a little bit, but honestly, that's pretty clean. That may actually be just the nature of the, if I went here and then maybe widened this out even further, like so. Now, that's just because that center part is, I suppose, more of a, let's see here. Yeah, that's helping with that. So, like you could get a nice broad gentle qualification within the qualifier, but like, is it going to be 1-to-1 as clean as your hue versus hue or your hue versus sat? I actually don't know, but I would also say like, I don't see any advantage to doing it here if the hue versus hue or the hue versus sat is giving you what you want. I would just go with that. And then, like you can actually, this is another fun thing you can do. If you wanted to do let's say we want to do a hue versus hue, okay? We want to take our reds and we want to bring them a little more kind of yellowy, like so. Something like that. But we only want to do that with like very saturated reds. You could actually, like, if it gets you the result that you want, you could actually combine this with a saturation qualifier. Like so. And say only do that on the more saturated stuff. And you can see here, because I've got a hard edge on that qualification, there's some really bad artifacting. But something like that is feeling interesting. And if I flip this off and then on, you can see the subtler effect that I'm having on the image by doing this. Or actually, I guess that would be the better point of comparison there. So anyway, you could even combine qualifier parameters and HSL curves if you wanted to do that. If you felt like there was something you like about your HSL curves, but now you need to go in and delimit your saturation or your luminance, you could actually do that. So that's another another fun option to explore if you are feeling that way. All right, guys. That was a really good session on qualifiers. We got to, I feel like I was optimistic about getting to the bottom of that whole business with qualifying in different color spaces. We definitely leave with more answers than we started with here today, but I also don't feel like we have all the answers, so we'll have to keep exploring. And this is a good reminder for me to reach out to Blackmagic and ask some of these questions directly if I can get some answers from the engineering team. And if I do, I'll be sure to share them with you guys because it's good stuff to be armed with in our color grading adventures. You guys are awesome. Thanks for being here. Thanks to my buddy Rafa for co-hosting with me. Always love seeing you guys on Friday mornings and exploring the craft and the science of color grading. So thank y'all as always. I hope you have an awesome Friday. I hope you have an awesome weekend, and I will see you next week here on the channel. Take care.